All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Chevron Learning Center at the Greater New Orleans Foundation's Center for Philanthropy. I'm Andy Copland. I'm the president and CEO of the foundation, and we are thrilled to have you here this afternoon and thrilled to be partners with NOLA.com and the Times-Picayune, as well as the New York Times, in helping sponsor today's event. As the Community Foundation for the 13 parish area in Southeast Louisiana, we're working on creating a vibrant, sustainable, and just region for all. And it's because of that work we've invested about $2.5 million in our environmental programs over the past 5 years, working to build the movement around living with water. We're focused on 3 areas principally, which is coastal land loss and restoration efforts. We're focusing on urban water management, making sure that we can manage the subsidence that's taking place inside our levees, and we're working on growing the water economy here in Southeast Louisiana. The recent series that NOLA.com, Times-Picayune, and the New York Times collaborated on focuses on the defining issue in the city of New Orleans and our region's history. It is the defining issue of our time, and like many of us over the past few decades, we have been calling attention not just to the people of Southeast Louisiana, but to the people of our nation about the urgent challenges that we face that have only grown greater with climate change and rising sea levels. So this panel this afternoon is going to be a great opportunity for us to hear from the reporters who did the work on this study, to hear their observations about this work. And I would urge both NOLA.com and the New York Times, and I think that it's going to be a continued effort to focus on the challenge that we face, but also the opportunity for us in Southeast Louisiana to be pioneers, to harness the 100 million tons of sediment that are coming down the Mississippi River, to attach it to Louisiana's science-based master plan and implement the largest restoration project in the world's history. We can do this. We can be the innovators and lead the way, and hopefully this most recent set of articles will not just spur the conversation here locally, but be a call to action nationally on the urgency of working on implementing Louisiana's coastal master plan for the future of this region, which benefits our entire country. So we're thrilled to have you here. I'm thrilled to be a partner in sponsoring this. I want to turn it over now to the president and CEO of NOLA.com, the Times-Picayune, my friend Tim Williamson, who helped put this partnership together between NOLA.com and the New York Times. So Tim.
Well, thank you, Andy, and thank you for hosting, and more importantly, your leadership in the city. Very quick, I want to frame up how we got here. This is an amazing opportunity for the NOLA Media Group and the New York Times to partner together, but it didn't just happen overnight. About a year and a half ago, we heard that the head of the New York Times, Dean Baquet, had this comment about his desire to preserve local journalism. And as you guys know, he's from New Orleans. And you might know his brother works at the Times-Picayune, NOLA.com. So the first thing we did, we said we heard this desire for the New York Times to really lean in for local journalism. So we called Terry up and said, Terry, we got to talk to Dean. How do we partner? And Terry said, if you really want to engage Dean, you got to call Jim Amos, the editor, former editor of the Times-Picayune. And what most people might not know is Jim and Dean worked together at the Times-Picayune a couple years ago, as we might say. And so that started the magic. We called Dean up and says, hey, Jim's interested in partnering together. So Dean and Jim came together, and they basically said, how do we come together to partner and leverage the New York Times and the NOLA Media Group to do something that's important for our community that preserves journalism? And this is what's happened today. And the work of the last year, almost year and a half, by this incredible team of collaborating came out about a month ago in the special section. And more importantly, this is a relationship that's just beginning. So we're working on some other things that we think can help foster this relationship, but also impact New Orleans. So one is, thank you for being here. I'd love to introduce the editor of the Times-Picayune and Vice President of Content for Nolan Media Group, Mark Lorando, who really drove this partnership, led this partnership, and more importantly, is one of the great leaders in our city, Mark Lorando.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Andy, for having us, and all of you for being here, a part of this very special event for us. As I was thinking this week about how best to tee up this conversation, I thought it'd be interesting to go back into the Times-Picayune's historical archives and see if I could locate the first ever reference to coastal erosion in Louisiana. And it turns out I'm not nearly patient enough to dig through 181 years of newspaper stories to find one phrase. But I did find what I'm pretty sure is the first piece of really in-depth reporting on coastal land loss as an issue that should be cause for alarm for our readers. And it was published on April 15th, 1979. The headline was "Marshland Dying Slowly But Surely." And it read, "This is a story about the quickening yearly loss of thousands of acres of marshland south of metropolitan New Orleans, the destruction of the city's buffer against the sea. Although much of it is occurring along the frayed southern reaches of Jefferson Parish, as a topic of great concern, it has hardly left the confines of a parish coastal commission exploring its dimensions. It is further removed yet from the urban public mind and the collective neural centers of Gretna and Fat City." Says Chairman John Ewell of his committee's findings, "That marsh out there is dying. It's dying now. And if we don't get out there and do something, it's not going to be out there for our grandchildren. The Gulf of Mexico is going to win." So here we are, nearly 40 years later. As predicted, Mr. Ewell's grandchildren do not have that marshland. Along the frayed southern edges of Jefferson Parish, people are raising their homes or moving to higher ground, and the Gulf of Mexico is still winning. So for what the Times-Picayune was an intriguing little story 39 years ago, today is the most important story that we will ever tell. And that's why last year we expanded our coastal team with the help of a grant from the Society of Environmental Journalism and the Walton Family Foundation, from 1 full-time reporter to 3 full-time reporters. It's why we joined forces with the New York Times on a groundbreaking local national journalism collaboration that we believe has successfully elevated this from a Louisiana issue to a national issue. And we are incredibly honored to have with us today, leading a further discussion and a further deepening of this journalism, Rebecca Blumenstein, who's the Deputy Managing Editor of the New York Times. Rebecca is going to introduce our journalists, ask them some questions, and then we're going to open the floor for all of you to ask some of yours. So please give Rebecca and our panel a warm welcome. Rebecca.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm incredibly honored to be here today to help moderate this important discussion with just enormous implications, both locally, regionally, and nationally. We're incredibly proud of this project at the New York Times and its impact. We were talking earlier this morning, and a couple of the reporters noted that when the series came out last month, the governor of Louisiana tweeted to thank the partnership for, quote, bringing our issue front and center. I would say on a personal note, I'm incredibly thankful to be here because I'm missing my 4th nor'easter to hit New York and New Jersey in the past 4 weeks. My husband is not as happy about that, and we can discuss on this panel whether any of this is related. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists, who quite frankly are some of the best reporters in America. I'm going to ask some questions for a few minutes, and then I will invite all of you to ask your questions as well. To my right, Mark Schwartz is a Times-Picayune environmental reporter. He's a nationally known environmental reporter. I'm not sure how many of you realize that the word on the street is that reporters around the world revere him. And you were part of the team that did the series Washed Away in 2002 that warned what would happen if a major storm hit New Orleans, and Katrina sadly proved you right, and you were part of the team that won the Pulitzer in 2006. Kevin Stack with the New York Times has covered national affairs for 30 years, has been both the Albany bureau chief, where I met him years ago, and the Atlanta bureau chief. He now works on the investigative team at the Times, where he's known for his narrative skills and finding people who can tell the larger stories, as he did in the series with Mayor Tim Kerner of Jean Lafitte. Sarah Sneath has an incredibly fascinating background, a former Marine who was one of 2 reporters at the Times-Picayune who was paid for by the Fund for Environmental Journalism. She and her counterpart, Tristan Balrick, had an incredibly important role on this series. Tristan wrote the story about insects and the toll that they're having on cane. And Sarah played an incredibly important role in every single story in this series. And I was struck backstage when you told me that as a Marine, you worked around the world, but decided to go into journalism because you wanted to ask questions, and you weren't allowed to ask many questions as a Marine. John Schwartz is a science writer for the New York Times and is on our climate team. We have a vertical that's devoted entirely to climate. And he really got his start in this kind of reporting, was one of the main reporters grew up on the Gulf Coast, where one of your earliest memories is living through hurricanes. Carla in 61 when you were 4 years old, and was one of our main reporters on Katrina. Which shaped a lot of your reporting and has ever since. I might also add that John is the author of a new book that's just coming out. This is the year I put my financial life in order, and I'm not clear if that has anything to do with coastal erosion. But we can discuss that. I'd like to ask all of you to start. You worked on this project for 10 months. What was the biggest, you're experts in your field. What was the biggest surprise to you? What did you learn, looking back on it now that just kind of sticks out? Mark, you want to start?
Unfortunately, I think what I learned was a confirmation of what I expected to see, which was that we have a levee system that was created for sort of a little bit of a falsehood. This what I call the devil's bargain, to make sure that people who live within the levee system in New Orleans were able to get insurance after Hurricane Katrina, while the Corps of Engineers was asked to rebuild the levee system to at least the standards that the flood insurance program allows, which is a 1% chance of a storm surge event occurring every year. And that we actually, number one, do need to have a greater protection because we're a major metropolitan area, and more importantly that now it's 2018 and sea level rise has caught up with our estimates of what a 500-year flood would be, so that the plans to elevate the levee system in the future that were in the Coastal Master Plan were not enough.
So it's kind of like reverse progress.
Right.
Kevin.
I think as a non-Louisianan, the big takeaway for us was that things are so different outside the wall and inside the wall. I'm not sure that people from outside the state really had this concept of the levee system and how it works, what it protects and what it doesn't protect. And so it was fascinating to us to come across a place like Lafitte, which is, for all intents and purposes, totally exposed. The mayor there is trying to build a relatively low tidal surge protection levee, but these areas are really vulnerable to the next big storm, as all of you know. And I think it was also striking to us to realize that the state had come to the point where there was now this growing acceptance that not all of coastal Louisiana could be salvaged, and that there were going to have to start being some real life and death decisions made by policymakers about which communities survive and which ones don't.
Yeah, I think what was most interesting to me, or most surprising to me, was that some of the communities that were most heavily impacted by Katrina are no longer, Katrina or a Katrina-like scenario is no longer what they worry about most, but the flooding in August is now the biggest concern for them. They worry that the infrastructure within the city is not adequate to meet the needs.
And for me, it was just the intractable nature of upgrading a system like this that I've written plenty over the last 13 years about what it's going to take, you know, what's required, and the incredible amounts of work and money that went into upgrading the hurricane, what we used to call the hurricane protection system for New Orleans, and then realizing through my work with Mark and the people that we talked to that a big wall across Lake Bourne is just about impossible to improve beyond, say, 1.5 feet, and that you can do levee lifts with earth, but you know, even so, there's just so much structure and everything else that once you hit that 100-year level, it's going to be very, very hard to get any farther. And that if they had planned for more from the beginning, you could have gotten more.
Let's go back to John Lafitte for a couple minutes. Kevin, you wrote about the mayor there who has been very successful in getting funding for auditoriums and all these infrastructure projects to kind of anchor the town down in a sense.
Right.
Is that a wise use of resources?
Well, that's sort of the ultimate question that our story asked. I mean, he feels that he has no choice at this point. He's been incredibly frustrated by his inability over his more than 26 years in office to get the massive amount of funding that would be needed to build real levee protection for the town. The state's latest estimate to build a ring levee around Lafitte is $1.2 billion to protect roughly 7,000 people. So I think we calculated it comes to about $175,000 per resident. You know, just not feasible. So his strategy has been to try to build the place up to the extent that that the infrastructure in town becomes so valuable that Lafitte can't be abandoned. He feels that this is an argument that he can take to Baton Rouge and to the parish and use it to bring more resources into the town, ultimately to try to build this levee that would really provide protection. But obviously, you know, it's a counterintuitive notion to keep building on land that is sinking. And so, you know, there are many who would not agree that it was a wise route.
Mark, the series and this story about Lafitte, gently and not so gently, raises this word retreat, which is something that is probably a little bit easier for outsiders to contemplate than people who live there. Do you think that communities like Lafitte should consider retreating?
That is the ultimate tough question for many communities across South Louisiana. Today, no. I think that there's still time to try to figure out how to provide them with protection. If you look at what the state's doing, it is attempting to put money that it does have through the BP oil spill into projects that will build wetlands just south of Lafitte. And in fact, you know, there's going to be $1 billion or more put into those individual projects over the next couple of years. That will provide some protection, and you heard this, the 7-foot-high levee that will be put around it will help. The other piece, though, is that the individuals in that community are going to have to face the decisions of their own, depending on their insurance, whether or not they can continue to get flood insurance that they can afford to pay, whether or not they can pay to elevate their homes, whether or not they can afford to move, and whether or not their jobs will allow them to move out of the way. There are a lot of people who live along our coastline outside the levee system that are there for a purpose. They work in the fisheries industry, and they have to be as close as possible because of the cost of getting their boats out to catch fish.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, we were talking before about all this money being spent on restoration. But you made the point that the only thing that really works is raising the houses, and there's not a lot of money for that. Could you?
Right, I wouldn't say the only thing that works, but the most direct, right? For the folks who are outside the levy system, I think the most direct approach would to give them money, to offer them compensation to elevate their homes or to move, and or to flood-proof their businesses. And this is money that's not being allocated. There's a lot of money being allocated for coastal restoration and for flood protection, but the amount of the money that would be set aside for actually giving people the resources to kind of, like you're saying, make those decisions on their own, that money is not being given out.
John, what role does climate change have to do with this in your estimation as someone who writes about this every day?
Well, climate change is a big factor when it comes to storm surge from hurricanes, for example, because even a little bit of extra water, sea level rise so far has been fairly low, but it's fairly low over all that water. So when a storm is out in the Gulf, it's sending in potentially bigger surges. And on top of that, climate change, because the Gulf is warming, is dumping a lot more moisture into the air. Moisture into the air comes down, which is the August flood, but it's also the Baton Rouge floods. It's also a huge amount of what adds to hurricane damage when they come through. It's not just the wind. So the scientists looking at climate change suggest that as the Earth warms further, we're going to see more of these powerful storms. That is, you'll see powerful storms more frequently. And I don't want to get completely in the weeds here, but it raises the energy that goes into storms. It also increases the amount of wind shear that cuts out a lot of storms. And so they're still trying to sort that out, except what they think is the storms that survive will be stronger. The storms that get past the wind shear will be stronger. All of this means that conditions are going to worsen, not get better. And so what we've seen so far, which is the big problem, has more to do with subsidence than climate change, and is going to turn into the bigger problem being climate change over time.
I want to go back to the retreat word again. Kevin, when we were talking earlier, it seems like you have a little bit of a different emphasis than Mark does on that notion. You think it's not too early, and indeed some young people aren't moving back.
Right. Well, certainly what we saw in Lafitte is that people are starting to retreat on their own, of their own accord. There's a real loyalty there among the lifers and longtime residents to the place. They are there because it's such a fantastic place to live, because it's such a great place to work along the water, and they've got a real commitment to it. But younger folks who are looking ahead to their futures are calculating that it may be easier to have a real future, and particularly for their kids, behind the wall of protection. Absolutely.
A question to all of you, is FEMA and the way that we kind of fund restoration playing the right role in helping people make these decisions, or is it going back and kind of rebuilding what perhaps shouldn't be rebuilt?
I'll start.
Okay.
I told you I wanted some debate.
So, unfortunately, I think that we who live in New Orleans especially know the problems with the way that FEMA has been set up to provide us with assistance after hurricanes. When you look at, for instance, the idea of elevating homes, a lot of communities are not eligible for money until they've been hit by a hurricane, until their homes have already been flooded, rather than providing them with mitigation grants in advance that would actually reduce the cost to the economy by reducing the damage. So that's a change that's been recommended by FEMA directors for at least 20 years and has gotten really no foothold in Congress so far, and so I think that's a key piece that is happening.
I mean, one thing I would say is that in a lot of these communities, and I'll keep going back to Lafitte because that's what I'm most familiar with, there will be a tipping point at some point where the markets make these decisions for people. When insurers will no longer insure, when bankers will no longer give loans, and then you'll start to see these communities dry up. Obviously, we can't predict when that will be, but in answer to the prior question, Rebecca, I mean, I do think that it's not too early for the state, as a matter of policy, to start looking at ways, at relocation, at more elevation, at more protective measures and measures to move people out of harm's way.
And I'd add to that too that there should be like an open-mindedness to that as well, because flood-proofing a business doesn't just mean you know, allowing water within that space, but it could be like for fishing communities, it could mean something completely different. Or it could be building alternative housing that is not structures that we currently see on the landscape.
And FEMA also, under the previous administration, FEMA was starting to incorporate climate change mitigation into the rebuilding plans. They were being told, look forward, don't just use historical data to determine what needs to be done in these places with the money, start incorporating climate change. The current administration is reversing that, dropping those requirements. And it seems like the first smart thing I've heard about FEMA in a long time, that they were going to be forward-looking instead of backward-looking. And that's stalled.
I want to move to New Orleans, where we're sitting here, and just read a line from the story, which may or may not be surprising to you, but struck me. This year, New Orleans celebrates its 300th birthday. Whether it will see 400 is no sure thing. Do you all agree with that statement?
I wrote it, so I think it's great. Fight me.
So
he's
he let him write it. Yeah, I let him write it. So here's the way I look at it. If you look 300 years ago, when Bienville and D'Iberville founded New Orleans, they chose a site that was the closest place to the mouth of the Mississippi River that was defensible. At that time, it was defensible against the English. We have English turn. That's what it was named for, was turning back the fleet. Today, we're still a major metropolitan community that is in the place that is the most defensible, closest to the mouth of the river. And that river is an important place for commerce for this country. We're the 5th largest port in the United States. And we have all of this industry here. There are reasons we live here. And the fact is that we have billions and billions, 100 billion, probably 200 billion worth of worth behind that levee system that needs to be protected. So we have to figure out how to deal with this issue. One of those things is trying to make sure that we're able to use nature to its best benefit. And the way to do that is to create some of these coastal restoration projects that will be able to keep up with elevated storm surge so that our wetlands continue to grow at the same pace. Whether or not that's possible, I don't know. Will we be able to keep the present footprint? Are we going to look like a boot or a sandal? We're going to look like a sandal, there's no question about it. But I think that there is a future for New Orleans if we're smart about it.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the levee system. You write that Mayor Landrieu wanted a system that would protect for a 10,000-year storm, similar to what the Netherlands has, and we do not have that. What's your view of what John, starting with you or anyone else who wants to jump in? I mean, it's really a mitigation.
I defer to Mark on all these issues. It's the only wise way to go.
Okay. So the reality is that we now have the best built levee system in the United States. It is the result of major scientific and engineering studies that were conducted as a result of Hurricane Katrina. The Corps relearned how to build levees as a result of what happened here. And they took that knowledge and built our levee system. It is not only it's built to protect us from water that reaches that 100-year level, but in terms of its ability to withstand being overtopped, it's probably closer to a 500-year system for what the Corps calls resilience. Next time, when the big one comes, the levees aren't going to disappear the way they did last time. So that's the positive part. The problem is, what do we do next? And again, in terms of time, I think we have time to start thinking about, well, are there ways of redesigning, for instance, the lake-borne barrier to make it light enough that you can, replace it with something that's lighter that won't cause it to sink so quickly but is still higher without affecting Mississippi? Or are there ways of rebuilding the wetlands out in the lake-borne area so that they reduce it? Or rebuilding the cypress forest in the central wetlands unit as a way of reducing some of that risk. Those are all things that the state's going to have to look at, and the master plan process provides us with the opportunity of doing that. Every 5 years, they start again to take a look at where we are today and what we need to do out 50 years.
And
so
I'd
that's
say the best part of the master plan is it's not one approach, it's all these approaches coming together.
All at once.
Because really hard problems don't have one solution. And so you've got a little bit of restoration, a little bit of rebuilding, and it just nibbling at it from all directions.
But not enough money.
Yeah, that's the problem. The problem with it, the master plan is that it's a plan, and it's not backed up by dollars, or at least not sufficient dollars, not anywhere close to enough sufficient dollars.
And Sarah, you've looked at the BP settlement and the role it's played in this, and
Right. Well, what we did is we looked through coastal restoration projects under the QIPRA, the federal funding that pays for some of these projects. And we dug through that and saw how much of that federal dollars have been used to restore land damaged by oil and gas. And this is a conversation that is very contentious, because it is Louisiana and it's a very oil and gas rich place. Oil and gas plays a large part in the economy, but we can't deny the history of the role the BP spill played in coastal erosion, and also digging of these oil and gas canals that also intensified the coastal erosion. And so our thought was, people talk a lot about these parish lawsuits that where parishes on the coast are suing oil and gas for in order to try to get them to repair and try to restore coastal wetlands that they helped damage. And this kind of goes to show that federal dollars are already going toward repairing that damage.
As you said, that's not the most popular notion around here. I must say that looking at the comments to the story, there were a number of readers who also called out the oil and gas industry. How feasible is that?
How feasible is
to hold them to
for
account
oil and
for
gas
the-
to be? Well, we're going to find out in court. It's going to be a number of years before we do find out. We have a former litigant among us, Mr. Berry, and he's now been succeeded by a number of parishes who have filed suit. And I think the first is supposed to go to court next year, 2019 in Plaquemines Parish. So 5 of them in Plaquemines Parish next year, right? So we'll see. I think the lawyers feel somewhat optimistic about the case that they've got to make, but
the case saying that they played a major role in the damage.
Yeah, the argument is, and we said in the story that it's sort of evocative of the anti-tobacco litigation of 20 or 30 years ago. The argument is that they knowingly destroyed the marshland through the dredging of these canals and the laying of pipelines and this type of thing, and continued on nonetheless, and that by doing so they violated various state regulations that require the repair of the land to essentially to its former state once they're done.
One of the key parts of that issue that's going to have to be dealt with in court is, so, okay, that's their culpability. How much culpability does the state and the local government have in not enforcing those provisions of state law and federal law? And that's going to be a key issue. It's been part of the previous cases in terms of what they call legacy lawsuits, and some judges have reduced the amount of money that they've required the industry to pay based on that sort of culpability. And also in terms of the time frame of when those laws took place and when events occurred in the context of when the laws were on the books. So all of those things are going to have to take place in court if it makes it that far, if there are not reasons found to throw it out. The other piece of that, though, is that, you know, we have a state government that has laws on the books that, you know, I was looking at it today, that say that when a canal is no longer being used, it's supposed to be filled. And that our state is not requiring that to happen raises some serious questions. It's an issue that has been very difficult to get raised in public.
And that'll be the defense.
Well, that will be part of the defense, right? Well, you know, why should we have to pay for this if the state didn't make us do it?
Right.
And on top of this all, we have this scale insects who are taking an enormous toll. Sarah, I know you did reporting on this. This is actually a relatively recent phenomena, and the devastation is, as your story pointed out, quite incredible.
Well, I would say invasive species have been, and Mark, this goes back to Mark and what I've learned from Mark over the 1 year time I've been here. But invasive species have been a problem in Louisiana for a very long time. And it's hard to identify when something like the scale, like when actually it came here, and because it's, you know, it was fishermen who notified us early last year, that they were seeing this. And then our calls to the state, or Tristan's more particularly, his calls to the state kind of started getting the state, you know, intrigued by this and investigating this issue. But not only the scale that is killing off a marsh grass that's helping keep marshland together, there's also nutria, which are a more well-known invasive species that munch at the roots of these marsh systems, and also cause coastal erosion as well as feral hogs. There's all sorts of plagues that are adding to this coastal erosion issue.
Right. Mark, you talked about the levee system before, and you made it sound pretty good, to be honest, that everything is okay. But you said that you often correct the mayor when he says
I do.
When he says that New Orleans is protected against you know, Category 2 or 3 storms.
Yeah.
So
well,
so
no, he didn't say 2.
this?
That's the problem.
Okay.
So the mayor has a habit, I've been trying to break him of saying that we're protected from a Category 3 hurricane. And there are 2 problems with that. Number one, after Katrina, the National Hurricane Center stopped using categories to talk about storm surge. And in fact, last year was the first year that we actually have a separate system of warnings just for storm surge that occur in different locations than the hurricane category warnings occur. So that's something to think about to begin with. The reality is that our levee system is built so that each individual piece of the levee system is designed to protect from a quote, 100-year event. Those 100-year events, though, are for the way they come in on that one little piece of system. And that makes it very complicated to try to figure out, well, where's overtopping going to occur? The reality is that we're going to have to evacuate for a Category 3 storm just about every time. I'm sure that's going to happen. Category 2, there's a good chance we'll have to evacuate because pieces of the levee system are going to be overtopped, so there will be water. It won't be as much as it was before Katrina. The estimates are maybe 5 feet maximum in the lowest places rather than the 20 feet that we saw during Katrina. But there are also, in some instances, there are some storms that can occur that could put water over top of our levee system when they're only a Category 1, just because of the specific way they come in and the way the water comes in. I'll give you an example of that. We have a high river event right now, and the water in the river in New Orleans is 17 feet above sea level. It's April. We don't have hurricanes now, right? Well, if we were to have a hurricane now and it came up the river, the storm surge would be on top of that river. And that would be something nobody would, even if it was a Category 1, you could have 5 to 6 feet of water above the 17 feet, and you'd have a huge flood. And there's nothing we could do about it. That's not likely to happen. I will be very clear about that. We generally don't get hurricanes until at least July. So hopefully the river will drop by then. But that's something to look for as we move forward. We're at risk.
John, could you talk about rain and flooding? Because there's the levee system, but then there's also the drainage system, which you were saying
right, and this builds on what Sarah was saying, that a huge amount of what the United States government spent to protect Katrina was to protect New Orleans after Katrina was from the external forces, from the surge, and that's what the walls are about. That's what the pumping stations are about. In the meantime, the system that gets water out of New Orleans was one of the grand engineering achievements of the turn of the 20th century.
The last
right, but it's been a long time, and it's the A.B. Wood screw pumps, am I right? Which are, again, world recognized as amazing, are being powered by generators that are idiosyncratic and a little flaky, and powered by special power stations, and the whole system is just not up to the kind of rainfall that's hitting this city now. And so there's great protection at the perimeter, but getting the water out of the city is an increasing challenge. And that's, as you were saying, what people are most scared of now. It's not like having a levee burst and houses wash down the street. It's just that you're going to have to rip up your carpet again. Mm-hmm. But that's a problem if it happens repeatedly.
Could we talk for a moment nationally? I mentioned the nor'easter situation earlier, but New York has coastal erosion concerns. Obviously, Houston has had issues with flooding. How much is coastal erosion a national issue at this point?
All the coastlines are facing this. We've got climate change lawsuits being heard in San Francisco, Oakland. There's one suit. Up and down California, this separate train of lawsuits is being brought because these municipalities and counties are afraid that they're going to be facing the effects of climate change, and they want to hold the fossil fuel companies responsible. My hometown of Galveston wants a wall, and lots of Mississippi and New York needs to build because of what Sandy showed us about our vulnerability. But it's not just coastal areas where rising sea levels and climate change are a problem. We've got this increased flooding. We're talking about high water on the Mississippi. We're seeing floods in areas all over the country that are worsening because of the increased moisture in the air, and it has to go somewhere. And don't even get me started on wildfires.
And meanwhile, development trends are driving people to the coast, so
Right.
we're putting more and more people in harm's way.
50% of the nation's population lives on coastlines.
Right.
But it's worse here than anywhere else, at least in the U.S. The wetlands, we're losing wetlands faster than all other U.S. states combined. And obviously that makes the situation more dire, but it also creates an opportunity because whatever we do here will be looked at. It'll be a model for how these other places deal with coastal erosion and land loss.
Yeah, and if you write for a newspaper like the New York Times and you write about the problems of a place like coastal Louisiana, you will hear from many readers who say, well, those damn people ought to move. Or they'll say it with a New York accent, or they'll say it with a Boston accent, or they'll say it with a Midwestern accent.
And then Sandy hit.
Yeah, exactly.